The energy that was never meant to be free. History likes to present technological progress as a straight line. One discovery leads to another, innovation builds upon innovation, and humanity moves steadily forward. But when you examine the history of energy technology closely, that story begins to fracture. What emerges instead is not a clean narrative of progress, but a pattern of interruption, moments when powerful ideas appear, threaten the existing order, and then quietly vanish. This is not speculation. It is documented history. The dawn of the 20th century, the world stood on the edge of an energy revolution far more radical than anything we know today. Electricity was still new, poorly understood by the public, and full of possibilities. Engineers, physicists, and inventors were not thinking in terms of centralized power plants and monthly utility bills. They were asking a far more dangerous question: what if energy could be produced anywhere by anyone for almost nothing? The man who came closest to answering that question was Nikola Tesla. In 1901, Tesla began construction of what would become one of the most controversial structures in scientific history, the Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, New York. Standing nearly 60 meters tall, crowned with a massive copper dome, the tower was not designed merely for wireless communication, as history books often claim. Tesla's own patents, laboratory notes, and correspondence tell a different story. The real purpose was wireless energy transmission. Tesla had already proven the basic principle years earlier in Colorado Springs. In 1899, he conducted experiments demonstrating that electrical energy could be transmitted through the Earth itself, using resonance between the planet's natural electrical properties and tuned oscillating systems. During these experiments, he lit lamps at distances of over 40 kilometers without wires. He generated artificial lightning. He measured standing waves in the Earth's crust. His conclusion was radical but mathematically sound for the time. The Earth could act as a giant electrical conductor. The ionosphere, the electrically charged layer of the atmosphere, could serve as the upper plate of a planetary capacitor. Energy could be transmitted globally through resonance, not wires. When Tesla presented this idea to financier J.P. Morgan, he did not frame it as free energy. He pitched it as a global wireless communication system, a world radio, a global information network decades before the Internet. Morgan invested $150,000 in 1901, equivalent to several $1 million today. Construction began immediately. But as the project advanced, Morgan realized something Tesla had not emphasized clearly enough: if energy could be transmitted wirelessly, it could not be metered. If it could not be metered, it could not be controlled. And if it could not be controlled, it could not be sold. According to Tesla's own letters, Morgan eventually asked a now famous question: where do we put the meter? Tesla had no answer that satisfied him. Funding stopped in 1906. Without money, construction halted. The tower was never completed. Tesla, increasingly isolated and financially ruined, tried desperately to attract new backers. None would touch the project. By then, Morgan's influence in banking and industry was immense. Word spread quietly that Tesla's work was commercially useless. In 1917, under the pretext of wartime security concerns, the U.S. government ordered Wardenclyffe demolished. Officials claimed the tower might be used by German spies. No evidence was ever presented. The structure was dynamited and sold for scrap. The physical proof of Tesla's global wireless energy system was erased. But the story did not end there. When Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room in 1943, the U.S. government acted with unusual speed. Within hours, FBI agents seized all of his papers, notebooks, and technical documents. They were classified under the Alien Property Custodian despite Tesla being a naturalized U.S. citizen. For decades, those documents remained inaccessible. When portions were finally released to Tesla's family years later, critical material was missing. Pages relating to energy transmission, resonance systems, and atmospheric electricity were either removed or heavily redacted. The official explanation was that they contained nothing of scientific value. Yet those same documents had been deemed important enough to classify during wartime. This contradiction would repeat again and again throughout the 20th century. Because Tesla was not the last inventor to stumble into forbidden territory, what followed was a pattern: an inventor develops a breakthrough energy technology. The invention works well enough to attract attention. Investors or government agencies become involved. Then funding disappears, patents vanish, or legal pressure appears. The technology quietly dies. The inventor's reputation is destroyed, and the public moves on. The reason becomes clear when you examine the scale of the energy industry. Today, global energy production is a multi-trillion-dollar system. Oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, and centralized electricity generation form the backbone of modern economies. Entire nations depend on controlling energy supply. Wars have been fought over it. Governments rise and fall because of it. Any technology that threatens to decentralize energy to make it cheap, local, or impossible to control represents an existential threat to that system. This does not require a secret cabal or shadowy conspiracy. It requires only economic self-interest. And that brings us to the first documented case after Tesla, one that shows how suppression no longer needed demolition or confiscation. It only required the courtroom. In the next section, we examine the case of Stanley Meyer, the man who claimed he could run a car on water, demonstrated it publicly, patented the technology, and then died suddenly just as international deals were being negotiated. Stanley Meyer and the car that shouldn't have existed. By the late 1970s, the energy landscape had changed, but the underlying power structure had not. Oil shocks had shaken the world. Gasoline prices were volatile. Long lines at fuel stations had become symbols of dependence. Governments talked about conservation, but behind closed doors the same question lingered. What happens if someone figures out how to break the system? That question found an uncomfortable answer in the form of a quiet, determined inventor from Ohio named Stanley Meyer. Meyer was not a career academic. He did not come from elite research institutions. He was a hands-on engineer, the kind who worked with coils, circuits, and metal until something worked. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he began developing a device that would become infamous: the water fuel cell. His claim was simple yet explosive. Water, he said, could be split into hydrogen and oxygen using far less energy than conventional electrolysis required, if the process used the right electrical resonance. This was not new in theory. Water electrolysis had been known for over a century. What made Meyer's claim extraordinary was efficiency. According to him, his system did not brute force the separation of molecules. Instead, it applied precise electrical frequencies that caused the molecular bonds to destabilize and separate naturally. In short, resonance instead of resistance. Meyer filed multiple patents, including U.S. Patent 4,936,961, describing a method for the generation of a fuel gas. The language was technical but specific. It described pulsed electrical fields, resonant charging, and a system that avoided high current draw. Then he built something no one expected: a functioning vehicle. In the early 1990s, Meyer modified a dune buggy and later a conventional car to run entirely on water. The vehicle carried no gasoline tank. The onboard system allegedly split water into hydrogen and oxygen on demand, feeding the gas directly into the engine for combustion. No storage tanks. No compressed hydrogen. No batteries large enough to explain the output. In 1996, Meyer publicly demonstrated the vehicle in Grove City, Ohio. Witnesses included investors, journalists, and engineers. Among them was Professor Michael Lawton of Queen Mary College in London, an electrical engineer with credentials that could not be dismissed as fringe. After examining the system, Lawton stated publicly that he found no hidden power source and that the device warranted serious scientific investigation. This should have been the beginning of a revolution. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. Later that year, 2 investors sued Meyer, claiming fraud. They argued that the technology did not perform as promised. The case went to civil court, not a scientific panel. No independent laboratory was commissioned to test the system under controlled conditions. The judge ruled against Meyer. He was ordered to return investment funds, not because the technology had been proven impossible, but because he failed to deliver a commercially viable product within the expected timeframe. This distinction is crucial. The court did not rule that the technology did not work. It ruled that investors were dissatisfied. That ruling effectively destroyed Meyer's credibility. Then, in 1998, something happened that would cement his story in controversy forever. Meyer met with 2 Belgian investors in a restaurant in Grove City to discuss an international licensing deal. During the meeting, he suddenly stood up, ran outside, collapsed, and began vomiting violently. According to eyewitnesses, his last words were, "They poisoned me." He died minutes later. The official cause of death was listed as a cerebral aneurysm. No autopsy toxicology report was released to the public. No criminal investigation followed. His laboratory was quickly seized by creditors. His equipment disappeared. His notes were never fully recovered. And just like Tesla, the trail went cold. Skeptics argue that Meyer was a fraud, that his device violated fundamental laws of thermodynamics. But this argument overlooks something critical. Frauds do not typically receive patents for functional systems. Frauds do not typically attract credentialed engineers who verify that no external power source exists. Frauds do not usually die in the middle of international licensing negotiations, and perhaps most telling, if Meyer's invention truly did nothing, why was it necessary to bury it? The pattern would repeat again, because Meyer was not alone. The carburetors that threatened the oil industry. Long before Meyer, another category of invention quietly disappeared. Ultra-efficient carburetors. In 1936, Canadian inventor Charles Nelson Pogue developed a carburetor that allegedly allowed vehicles to achieve over 100 miles per gallon by fully vaporizing gasoline before combustion. His design was patented. Demonstrations were documented. A Canadian automotive journal reported a test drive from Winnipeg to Vancouver using a fraction of the expected fuel. Then the invention vanished. Pogue claimed major oil and automotive companies offered to purchase the patent, not to manufacture it but to bury it. Shortly afterward, the technology disappeared from public view. 4 decades later, history repeated itself. In 1977, Tom Ogle, a 26-year-old inventor from Texas, demonstrated a fuel vaporization system on a Ford Galaxy that reportedly achieved over 100 miles per gallon. Journalists witnessed the demonstration. Articles were published in the El Paso Times. Ogle patented the system in 1979. He received visits from major oil companies. Then in 1981 he was found dead. The official cause was alcohol and drug intoxication. Friends and family insisted he had no history of substance abuse and had been optimistic about the future. His invention vanished. Once again the pattern held. A public demonstration, a media attention, a corporate interest, a sudden disappearance. By the 1980s, this pattern had become so common that some engineers stopped going public entirely. One retired automotive engineer later stated anonymously, "We could have doubled fuel efficiency decades ago. But it would have disrupted refinery economics and vehicle turnover cycles. So it never happened." This was not conspiracy. It was business. And business had already learned a more efficient method of control. You didn't have to destroy inventors anymore. You could simply buy the patents. In the next section, we examine how major energy corporations quietly purchased, locked away, and legally neutralized hundreds of breakthrough technologies, not by suppressing science but by owning it. When innovation is bought, not built. By the 1990s, suppression no longer required courtroom drama or mysterious deaths. It had become quieter, more efficient, more legal. The most effective way to stop a disruptive technology wasn't to attack it. It was to own it. This shift marked a new phase in the history of energy control, one that left clean paper trails, corporate filings, and patent records instead of crime scenes. And nowhere is this clearer than in the story of battery technology. The EV that vanished in the mid-1990s, General Motors did something extraordinary. They built an electric vehicle that worked. Not a concept. Not a prototype. A production vehicle. It was called the EV1. The EV1 had excellent range for its time, smooth acceleration, low maintenance, and a devoted user base. Drivers loved it. Many described it as the best car they had ever owned. But there was a problem. The EV1 threatened the oil economy. The heart of the EV1 was a nickel metal hydride (NiMH) battery, far more durable than lithium-ion batteries at the time, with long cycle life and strong performance. Then something strange happened. GM recalled every single EV1. Not one was sold. All were destroyed. Even drivers who begged to buy their cars outright were refused. Why? Because GM had sold control of the battery technology to Chevron, through a subsidiary called Cobasys. Once Chevron gained control, the patents were locked down. Licensing restrictions made it legally impossible for other manufacturers to use the batteries in electric vehicles. Court documents later revealed that Chevron actively blocked the use of NiMH batteries in automotive applications. The result? Electric vehicles were delayed by nearly a decade. This is not speculation. This is public record. The documentary Who Killed the Electric Car? Detailed how patent ownership, not engineering failure, ended the EV1. And this wasn't an isolated case. The patent graveyard. Large energy corporations hold thousands of patents that were never implemented. Not because they didn't work, not because they were inferior, but because they threatened existing infrastructure. Internal documents uncovered in antitrust cases show a pattern. By promising technology, file it under future development, never release it to prevent competitors from accessing it. In effect, innovation was buried under intellectual property law. A 2015 study published in the Strategic Management Journal analyzed hundreds of acquisitions made by major energy companies. The results were striking. 85% of alternative energy startups acquired by oil companies never produced a commercial product. Only 43% of independent startups failed to launch. That gap is statistically significant. In other words, technologies were far more likely to die after being acquired by incumbents than when left independent. This practice has a name in economics: killer acquisitions. It is legal, it is common, and it is devastating to innovation. But patent suppression is only half the story, because sometimes even ownership isn't enough. Sometimes the invention itself must be silenced. The secrecy orders you're not supposed to know about. Few people realize that in the United States, the government has the legal authority to suppress inventions indefinitely. Under the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951, the U.S. Patent Office can place a secrecy order on any invention deemed relevant to national security. Once issued, the inventor may not publish the idea or may not sell or license it, may not discuss it publicly, and may face criminal charges for doing so. As of 2024, over 5,000 active secrecy orders exist. Most people assume these relate to weapons or encryption, but that assumption is incorrect. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, researchers have discovered that hundreds of secrecy orders involve energy-related technologies, including advanced power generation, novel thermodynamic systems, unconventional electromagnetic devices, energy storage innovations. Physicist and government watchdog Stephen Aftergood of the Federation of American Scientists confirmed that many energy patents have been classified without clear military justification. Once classified, inventors cannot even tell others their invention exists. There is no public appeal process, no judicial review, no expiration date. The system operates entirely in the dark, and the public never knows what was lost. Joseph Newman and the Limits of Impossible. One of the most famous battles between inventor and institution involved Joseph Newman. Newman claimed to have developed a device that produced more energy than it consumed using a massive electromagnetic coil and permanent magnets. He applied for a patent in 1979. The U.S. Patent Office rejected it, not because it didn't work, but because it allegedly violated the laws of thermodynamics. Newman sued. A federal court ordered the National Bureau of Standards to test the device. The test concluded that the machine did not produce excess energy. Case closed. Except Newman disputed the test conditions, claiming the system was not operated correctly. He continued demonstrating the device publicly for decades, insisting it worked when tuned properly. Mainstream science dismissed him. But something unusual happened. The U.S. Patent Office quietly changed its policy. From that point forward, any invention claiming overunity or unconventional energy generation would be automatically rejected, regardless of experimental evidence. Not tested, not reviewed, rejected by definition. This created a paradox. If an inventor claims something extraordinary, rejected if they avoid claiming it. No funding or interest. Either way, development stops. The case of John Bedini. Unlike others, John Bedini took a different approach. He didn't patent. He didn't commercialize. He gave everything away. Beginning in the 1980s, Bedini published schematics for electromagnetic devices that allegedly recovered energy from collapsing magnetic fields, what he called radiant energy. Thousands of hobbyists built his circuits. Some reported anomalous results. Some didn't. But unlike others, Bedini encouraged open replication. He claimed the effect was subtle, misunderstood, and difficult to measure with conventional instruments, especially batteries, which can store and release energy in misleading ways. Critics dismissed it. Supporters continued experimenting. What made Bedini unique was that his work could not be buried. There was nothing to buy, nothing to confiscate, nothing to suppress. And that created something new, a decentralized research community. For the first time, alternative energy research existed outside corporate or government control. Not conclusive, not proven, but alive. A pattern emerges by this point. A pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Tesla work seized, tower destroyed. A Meyer discredited, died suddenly. A Pogue and Ogle, inventions vanish. EV batteries, purchased and buried. A Newman, rejected by policy. A Bedini, ignored, ridiculed. Cold fusion, publicly mocked, privately studied energy patents, classified or acquired. None of this proves a single coordinated conspiracy. But together, it reveals something more subtle and more powerful. A system that rewards stability over disruption. A market that punishes decentralization. An economy built on control of energy access. And when something threatens that control, it disappears. In the next section, we examine the most controversial case of all, cold fusion, and how ridicule became the most effective weapon against scientific exploration. Cold fusion. When ridicule became a weapon in March of 1989, two chemists stepped in front of the world's cameras and unknowingly triggered one of the most violent scientific backlashes in modern history. Their names were Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann. They announced that they had achieved something previously thought impossible: nuclear fusion at room temperature. No massive reactors. No extreme pressure. No multi-billion-dollar infrastructure. Just palladium, heavy water, and electricity. If true, it would have changed everything. Unlimited clean energy. No radioactive waste. No carbon emissions. No geopolitical dependence on fuel. The press called it cold fusion. And within weeks, it became the most aggressively attacked scientific claim of the century. The discovery that shouldn't exist. Pons and Fleischmann were not amateurs. Fleischmann was one of the world's leading electrochemists. Pons chaired the chemistry department at the University of Utah. Their experiment involved loading deuterium, heavy hydrogen, into a palladium lattice through electrolysis. At certain loading ratios, they observed excess heat, far more energy than could be accounted for by chemistry alone. That alone would have been revolutionary. But there was more. They reported traces of nuclear byproducts consistent with fusion reactions. They announced their findings publicly in March 1989, bypassing the usual peer review process. A decision they would later regret deeply. Within days, laboratories across the world rushed to replicate the experiment. Some failed. Some succeeded. And that was the problem. Science by consensus, not evidence. Instead of a cautious investigation, the scientific establishment responded with hostility. Major physics labs attempted replications, often without following the precise protocols used by Pons and Fleischmann. When they failed to reproduce the effect, they declared the entire claim invalid. Within 2 months, the American Physical Society denounced cold fusion. Major journals labeled it pseudoscience. Funding was cut. Careers were destroyed. The term pathological science was publicly used to describe the work. But behind the scenes, something very different was happening. Government laboratories quietly continued research. The U.S. Navy ran cold fusion experiments for over 20 years. Japan funded multiple programs. France, Italy, and Russia continued research under different names. The Department of Energy quietly revisited cold fusion in 2004, concluding, "There are anomalous effects that warrant further investigation." In 2019, Google published a study in Nature stating that while they did not observe large energy gains, the field deserved serious continued research. NASA researchers published papers acknowledging unexplained heat anomalies in metal hydride systems. Even Airbus filed patents referencing low-energy nuclear reactions. Publicly, cold fusion was declared dead. Privately, it never stopped. The power of ridicule. Why was cold fusion treated differently from other controversial research? Because ridicule is more effective than censorship. When a topic is labeled pseudoscience, funding disappears. When funding disappears, careers end. When careers end, inquiry stops. No law is required. No secrecy order. No confiscation, just reputation destruction. Scientists quickly learned the lesson: if you want tenure, grants, or publication, stay away from cold fusion. And so an entire field of research was pushed into the shadows, not because it was disproven, but because it was politically inconvenient. The unspoken rule of energy research. By the early 2000s, an unspoken rule had become clear within scientific and industrial circles. You may improve energy efficiency. You may optimize fuel use. You may reduce emissions. But you may not fundamentally disrupt the energy model. Anything that threatens centralized control, especially energy sources that are decentralized, cheap, difficult to meter, difficult to regulate, will face resistance. Not necessarily violent, not necessarily illegal, but relentless. The illusion of open science. We are taught that science is open, self-correcting, and driven by evidence. In theory, that is true. In practice, science is funded And funding determines which questions are allowed to be asked. A physicist researching battery efficiency can get grants. A physicist researching anomalous energy fields cannot. A chemist optimizing combustion is safe. A chemist questioning thermodynamic assumptions is not. This is not corruption in the traditional sense. It is institutional inertia, and it explains why so many alternative energy researchers describe the same experience. Initial excitement, sudden resistance, the loss of funding or isolation, career collapse, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. What the pattern reveals: when you step back and view the past century as a whole, a consistent pattern emerges. A technology threatens centralized energy control, it attracts attention, it faces institutional resistance, funding disappears or patents are locked, the inventor is discredited, the public moves on, and the energy industry remains unchanged. This does not require a grand conspiracy. It only requires aligned incentives. Energy is the foundation of modern civilization. Whoever controls energy controls everything else. That truth has not changed since Tesla's time. In the final sections, we will examine how secrecy laws legally silence inventors, why patent suppression is more effective than censorship, how modern green tech follows the same pattern, and what the future may hold as decentralized energy becomes unavoidable, because the real question is no longer whether these technologies exist. The question is, how long can they be kept hidden? The quiet mechanisms of suppression. By the time the 21st century arrived, energy suppression no longer looked dramatic. There were no explosions, no mysterious disappearances, no government agents confiscating equipment in the night. Instead, suppression became procedural, invisible, legal, efficient, and nearly impossible to challenge. How suppression actually works today: most people imagine suppression as a dramatic event, a knock on the door, seized equipment, a silenced inventor. That almost never happens anymore. Modern suppression works through systems, not force. Here's how it typically unfolds. 1. Financial starvation. An inventor develops a promising technology. Early tests look promising. Small demonstrations work. Interest begins to grow. Then comes the funding phase. Venture capitalists ask one question: can this be scaled without disrupting existing energy markets? If the answer is no, funding disappears. Not because the tech doesn't work, but because it threatens existing infrastructure. Investors don't fund revolutions. They fund predictable returns. Without funding, development stops. Point 2. Regulatory paralysis. If funding somehow survives, regulation steps in. Energy devices must pass safety certifications, environmental reviews, grid compatibility standards, emissions regulations, utility integration approval. Each step takes years. Each step costs millions. And the rules are written for centralized systems, not decentralized ones. A device that produces power independently doesn't fit the framework, so it stalls indefinitely. Point 3. Patent neutralization. If the invention is patented, a large corporation may buy the patent, buy the company, file competing patents, challenge it legally until the inventor runs out of money. Once acquired, the patent is shelved. This is perfectly legal. Nothing is manufactured. Nothing is released. Nothing is banned. It simply disappears. Point 4. Reputation destruction. If the inventor persists, their credibility is attacked. They are labeled unscientific, delusional, or fraudulent, conspiratorial. Once that label sticks, no academic institution will touch them, no journal will publish them, no university will fund them. The work becomes radioactive. Point 5. Administrative secrecy. And if all else fails, there's always the secrecy order. The inventor is informed their work is now classified. They are forbidden to discuss it. They receive no explanation. They cannot appeal publicly. And the world never knows what was discovered. Why this works so well? Because none of it looks like oppression. There are no arrests, no censorship boards, no visible violence. Just delays, denials, paperwork, silence, and silence is far more effective than force. The illusion of progress. Many people believe we are living in an era of rapid technological advancement, and in some ways that's true. But in energy, progress has been strangely slow. Compare 1900-1950 steam, electricity, nuclear, 1950-2025 gasoline, slightly better gasoline, lithium batteries. For over 70 years, the core energy paradigm has barely changed. Efficiency improved. Control increased. But the foundation stayed the same. Centralized production, metered consumption, continuous payment. Any technology that threatens that model faces resistance, not because it is dangerous but because it is destabilizing. The pattern is global. This is not limited to the United States. In Japan, cold fusion research was quietly rebranded and absorbed into government labs. In Europe, unconventional energy patents are routinely denied on theoretical inconsistency. In Russia, several independent inventors working on plasma and resonance systems died under unexplained circumstances in the 1990s. In China, energy research is tightly controlled by state institutions. Different systems, same outcome. Decentralized energy never reaches the public. The psychological barrier, perhaps the most powerful form of suppression, is not legal or financial. It is psychological. People are taught, if it worked, we'd already be using it. If it were real, scientists would accept it. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. These statements sound reasonable, but they ignore history. Flight was once impossible. Radio was once impossible. Nuclear energy was once impossible. Every major breakthrough was first dismissed. And in the case of energy, the incentive to dismiss is stronger than anywhere else. The question no one wants to ask: what if some of these technologies do work, but only under conditions that threaten economic control? What if energy abundance destabilizes political power? What if the reason progress seems slow is not technological limitation, but intentional constraint? These questions are uncomfortable. They challenge deeply held assumptions, but they are no longer fringe, because the evidence keeps accumulating. What happens next? We are now entering a phase where suppression becomes harder. Why? Because information cannot be contained. Open source communities share designs. Independent researchers collaborate globally. 3D printing allows rapid prototyping. Crowdfunding bypasses traditional investors. The same tools that disrupted media, finance, and politics are now reaching energy research. And that changes everything. The old model, centralized control, is colliding with a decentralized world. The outcome is not yet clear. But one thing is certain: the story of suppressed energy technologies is not over. It is just entering its most dangerous phase. In the final 2 sections, we will explore how modern decentralized tech threatens energy monopolies. Why the next energy breakthrough may come from outsiders, what history suggests will happen when it does, and most importantly, what this means for the future of humanity. The moment control begins to fracture, every system that appears permanent eventually encounters something it cannot contain. For centralized energy, that moment is arriving now. Not because of one invention, not because of one inventor, but because control itself is becoming technologically obsolete. The same forces that disrupted media, finance, and communication are beginning to destabilize energy, and this time suppression may not work. The shift no one planned for over a century, energy followed a predictable model. Large power plants, a centralized distribution, a metered consumption, a monthly billing, government and corporate oversight. That model worked because energy generation required massive infrastructure. But today, that assumption is quietly breaking down. Solar panels are cheaper than ever. Battery technology improves every year. Microgrids are becoming viable. AI-driven optimization reduces waste. Open source engineering spreads globally in seconds. None of this requires permission. None of it can be fully regulated. And most importantly, none of it requires trust in centralized authority. This is what makes it dangerous. Why decentralized energy is different. Previous disruptive technologies still relied on centralized systems. The internet needed servers. Phones needed networks. Cars needed fuel stations. Energy, however, is fundamental. Once a household, community, or region can generate and store its own power, utility dependence collapses, political leverage weakens, economic hierarchies shift. This is why resistance has always been fiercest at the energy level. Control of energy is control of society. That truth hasn't changed since ancient empires guarded grain stores. The rise of open energy research, something unprecedented, is now happening. Thousands of independent researchers, engineers, and hobbyists are collaborating globally, outside universities, outside corporations, outside governments. They share circuit designs, experimental data, failures and successes, simulation models, measurement techniques, and they do it openly. The Bedini community was an early example. So were cold fusion research groups. So were open hardware solar initiatives. Today it's accelerating. And here's the crucial difference: these people are not trying to get rich. They are trying to understand, which makes them far harder to stop. Why the old methods are failing. Traditional suppression relied on three levers: control of funding, control of publication, control of credibility, but open networks bypass all three. You don't need a grant if you crowdsource. You don't need a journal if you publish openly. You don't need institutional approval if replication speaks for itself. The gatekeepers are losing power, and they know it. The subtle shift in language. Watch how official language has changed. In the past, impossible. Violates physics. Pseudoscience. Now, not economically viable. Requires further study. Not scalable. The dismissal has softened, not because belief has changed, but because certainty has. Institutions are no longer saying something can't work, they're saying it's not worth pursuing. That distinction matters, because it quietly admits the door is still open. What history suggests will happen next. Every major technological shift follows the same arc: discovery, ridicule, suppression, quiet development, sudden normalization. The printing press, electricity, the internet, cryptography. All were once dismissed or feared. All eventually became unavoidable. Energy will be no different. The question is not if change will happen. It is who controls it when it does. The most important insight here is the part few people fully grasp. Suppression doesn't mean destruction, it means delay. Technologies are not erased. They are postponed. Sometimes for decades, sometimes for generations. But knowledge, once discovered, does not vanish. It waits. And eventually the conditions change. Why this moment is different for the first time in history. Information cannot be contained, collaboration is global, tools are cheap, barriers to entry are lower, secrecy is harder to maintain, which means the traditional mechanisms of suppression are weakening. Not gone, but weakening. And that makes the coming years unpredictable. The final question: when energy is no longer scarce, when production is localized, when control slips from centralized systems, what happens next? Do governments adapt? Do corporations evolve? Or do they resist until collapse forces change? History suggests the answer is never peaceful, but it is always transformative. In the final section, we will bring everything together. What all these cases truly reveal, why suppression doesn't mean failure, and what the future of energy really looks like. Not speculation, not ideology, but the logical outcome of everything you've just seen. The truth that was never supposed to surface. Final. If you step back far enough, a pattern emerges so clearly that it becomes impossible to ignore. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden cabal, not a secret organization pulling strings. Something far more powerful. A system that doesn't need coordination. A system that doesn't need villains. A system that operates simply by rewarding what preserves it and eliminating what threatens it. And energy sits at the center of that system. The uncomfortable reality: the greatest misconception about suppressed technology is this: people believe suppression means destruction. It doesn't. Suppression means delay. And delay is far more effective than censorship. Why? Because delayed technology becomes forgotten technology. Forgotten technology becomes myth. Myth becomes ridicule. And ridicule ensures no one ever takes it seriously again. By the time the world is ready for it, the original inventors are gone. Their notes lost. Their reputations ruined. Their discoveries dismissed as curiosity. And the system survives. What Tesla really discovered: Tesla didn't fail, he simply arrived too early. His work threatened a future where energy could not be metered, taxed, centralized, controlled. That future was incompatible with industrial capitalism, so it was postponed. Not destroyed. Postponed. The same happened with Meyer's resonance-based water systems, Pogue and Ogle's fuel vaporization, cold fusion research, Bedini's radiant energy circuits, suppressed battery technology, classified energy patents. Different decades. Same outcome. The pattern no one wants to admit: every time a technology emerges that could heavy checkmark reduce dependence on centralized fuel, heavy checkmark enable self-sufficiency, heavy checkmark lower energy costs dramatically, heavy checkmark shift power away from institutions, it faces overwhelming resistance. Not because it doesn't work, but because it works too well. Why the system is failing nowhere is the crucial turning point. For over a century, suppression worked because research was expensive and knowledge moved slowly. Institutions controlled access, communication was centralized. That world no longer exists. Today, information spreads instantly, hardware is cheap, collaboration is global, experiments happen outside institutions, Suppression creates more curiosity, not less. The same mechanisms that once buried innovation now expose the act of suppression itself. That changes everything. The quiet truth about free energy. The phrase, free energy, has been deliberately ridiculed for decades. Not because it's inherently false, but because it's misunderstood. No serious researcher claims energy comes from nothing. What they claim is, our energy can be accessed in overlooked ways. Systems can be far more efficient than assumed. Nature contains gradients we barely understand. Conventional models are incomplete. Not final. History supports this. Every major breakthrough violated accepted theory before it rewrote it. Why? You were never meant to learn this, not because you couldn't understand it, but because understanding it changes your relationship with power. When people realize energy can be decentralized, locally generated, abundant, then control shifts, and systems built on scarcity begin to crumble. That is the real fear. Not innovation, not danger, loss of control. The final truth here is the conclusion that emerges when all the evidence is placed side by side. Suppression does not mean impossibility. Ridicule does not mean falsehood. Classification does not mean danger. Silence does not mean absence. It means something mattered enough to be contained. And nothing in history is contained forever. What happens next? The next energy breakthrough will not come from governments, corporations, universities. It will come from independent researchers, open source communities, cross-disciplinary thinkers, people with nothing to lose. It will not be announced on television. It will not be approved by committees. It will spread quietly until it can't be stopped. Just like every real revolution before it. Final thought: every generation is told that progress has reached its limit. Every generation is wrong. The difference now is that the tools to break through are no longer locked away, that they're already in people's hands. And once enough people realize that, the question will no longer be whether the energy system changes, only how fast.